Okay, so today we are going to learn about the nervous regulation of respiration. So, nervous regulation of respiration. Okay, so now nervous regulation is brought about by two systems. Okay, now first is the voluntary control. Voluntary is brought about by the cerebral cortex. Second is the automatic, which is brought about by the pacemaker cells in the pre-Botzinger complex. Now this is responsible for the rhythmic discharge. Okay, now we need to learn about the respiratory centers. So the respiratory centers first is the medullary respiratory center. Okay, so of course it is situated in the medulla. It is situated in the ventrolateral part of the medulla. Okay, now this shows rhythmic discharge. Rhythmic discharge of varying frequency. So varying frequency. It has two types of neurons, again two types. One involved in inspiration and others involved in expiration. So these will discharge only during inspiration, while these during expiration. So now let's say these are I neurons, while these are E neurons. Okay, now go back. The second respiratory center is the pontine respiratory center. The pontine respiratory center is divided into apneustic and pneumotoxic centers. Okay, so apneustic center is in the lower pons, while the pneumotoxic is in the upper pons. Okay, apneustic will activate only I neurons, while this contains both or activates both I and E neurons. Okay, now the apneustic center is inhibited by the vagus or the 10th cranial, and the pneumotoxic center will inhibit the apneustic center. Okay, so will inhibit apneustic center. Okay, then we go back to the medulla. Okay, so the neurons in the medulla can be divided or are located in two groups. Okay, so dorsal group of neurons or DRG. Okay, these consist of I neurons, and they will provide rhythmic discharge to the diaphragm via phrenic nerve. Dorsal group receives afferents from chemoreceptors and the airways, that is like a pathway, airways via 10th and 11th nerves. Okay. The next group is the ventral group of neurons, or VRG, ventral group of neurons. It extends through nucleus ambiguous, Yeah. So it is important to note that the inspiratory neurons and the expiratory neurons are reciprocally innervated. What does reciprocally innervated mean? Reciprocally innervated is this will inhibit this and this will inhibit this. So reciprocally innervated. Okay. So now that we know about the respiratory centers, okay, we'll move on. Now, the dorsal group of neurons, which we just discussed, the dorsal group of neurons is responsible for the normal inspiration and the rhythm of respiration. Okay, rhythm of respiration in quiet breathing, that is normal breathing. Okay. Now, DRG, its discharge is to inspiratory muscles, of course, because it is involved in normal inspiration during quiet breathing. So inspiratory muscles. So this discharge is in the form of a ramp signal. Okay. So what is a ramp signal? Okay. So a ramp signal. So the discharge of the dorsal group is not instantaneous. But it begins weekly. Increases for about 2 seconds and then ceases abruptly. So how is it? So it is something like let's say, okay, let's say this. So it will increase for about 2 seconds and then fall abruptly. Okay. So what is the advantage of this? The advantages, okay, this causes a steady increase and prevents sudden expansion. Sudden expansion is prevented. So the dorsal group is responsible for normal breathing. It does so via ramp signal and it prevents sudden expansion of the lung. Okay. Now the ventral group not involved in quiet respiration. Okay. Non-respiration. Its activity only increases in cases of when pulmonary ventilation increases. So active when increased pulmonary respiration. Okay, that's ventral group. Okay. Now the apneistic center. And the apneistic center prevents turning off of ramp signal. Of ramp signal. Okay. So So okay. So the apnestic center prevents the turning off of ramp signal. So what it essentially does is that it will prevent this cessation. So this cessation is prevented. Okay. So now you understand. Good. So now we understood what the apnestic center does. Now the pneumotaxic center, which is located in the upper pons. Pneumotaxic center switches off the ramp signal. Okay, switches off the ramp signal via DRG. So therefore limits inspiration. So if pneumotaxic center is absent, the ramp signal will go on continuing, never ending, and it would lead to very greater expansion of the lungs, which is harmful. Okay. Now, where were we? Okay. So just remember this. Now what do we know? Expiratory neurons. Okay. Inspiratory neurons. Okay. How are these innervated? Reciprocally, right? So mine reciprocally they inhibit each other. Perfect. Okay. Now the inspiratory neurons via the spinal cord neurons, of course, neurons. So these via the phrenic and intercostal nerves. Okay, by the phrenic and intercostal nerves will supply the lung and the diaphragm. Okay. Perfect. Now the lung has stretch receptors. Okay. Now these, in cases of excessive inspiration or when the size increases, okay, these stretch receptors will go and inhibit the apnestic center. So this, which prolonged the inhibition, it will inhibit it because it is excessive air coming in. This is done by the vagus or the 10th cranial nerve. Okay. The apnestic center. The apnestic center, it inhibits. Okay. Now the apnestic center is also inhibited by the pneumotaxic center. Okay. So the pneumotaxic center also inhibits. Okay. We know these are reciprocally innervated. The pneumotaxic center activates or has a stimulating effect on the E neurons. Pneumotaxic centers work limit inspiration, so it will activate the E neurons. Okay. The apnestic center prolongs I neurons, so stimulatory effect on I neurons prolongs inspiration. Okay. So once the inspiration is done, then I neurons are not only inhibited to E neurons, they'll send a stimulatory signal to pneumotaxic center, which will again activate the E neurons. So we see that, let's start with inspiration. So I neurons will send the signals via the spinal cord neurons, via the phrenic and the intercostal nerves to the lungs and the diaphragm for inspiration. As lungs are inflated, the stretch receptors will as the lungs are excessively, in case the lungs are excessively inflated, the stretch receptors in the lungs will send a negative signal to the apnestic center. So inhibition of apnestic center will in turn inhibit the inspiratory neurons, causing expiration to start. In case of normal inspiration, the inspiratory centers are reciprocally innervate the expiratory neurons. So after inspiration, the pneumotaxic center will work. The pneumotaxic center activates the expiratory neurons, which inhibit the inspiratory neurons. Okay. Also, the inspiratory neurons will go back via the pneumotaxic center to do the same work. Okay. So this diagram can be learnt. It is very easy. So you'll get the functions of each centers. Okay. Now factors affecting the respiratory centers. Okay, first is the cerebral cortex. So this is initially for voluntary activity. Certain areas such as the anterior cingulate gyrus, when stimulated, will lead to depression of or inhibit respiration. Okay. Then second is the hypothalamus and limbic system. So pain and emotional disturbance stimulates respiration, while fever produces tachypnea, shallow rapid breaths. Okay, so those are the two. First is the cerebral cortex, the other is the hypothalamus and the limbic system. The third, more importantly, are stretch receptors. So factors which affect the respiratory centers. So these are located in the smooth muscles of the airway. Okay, smooth muscles of the airway. Important reflex. I'll write it with another. Okay, herring, Brewer, inflation, reflex. Okay, so the herring. So what it essentially is, if there is a steady inflation, okay, now there is excessive or the lungs are stretched. Okay, so the stretch receptors, also called J receptors, important J receptors via the vagus send inhibitory signals to the apneustic center. As we saw in the diagram, send inhibitory signals in the apneustic center and lead to expiration. So therefore, excessive inflation prevented. Okay, so it prevents the excessive inflation of the lungs. Similarly, there is a herring-Brewer's deflation reflex too. Okay, the J receptors are also sensitive to content of interstitial fluid. Okay, the fourth factor which affects are irritant receptors. Okay, they're present in the airways, and stimulation produces coughing and sneezing. So coughing, sneezing. So this is to remove the particles or the irritants in the lung. Okay. One important or interesting thing is known as Ondine's curse. Ondine's curse related to neural control of respiration. So Ondine's curse, because there is a Greek story, a backstory, not important, but it is known as the central hypoventilation syndrome. Okay, now what happens is the neural control is lost. Neural control of respiration is lost. So what happens is the DRG is affected. So the neural control is lost, but more specifically, only the automatic control specifically. Okay, automatic control is lost specifically. Okay, so the motor control is still present. Motor voluntary control is still present. Okay, so what happens is the person has to voluntarily breathe at all times. Because automatic control is lost, so the person has to voluntarily breathe at all times. So if a person sleeps, okay, since there is no voluntary activity, he'll die of sleep. Okay, so no voluntary activity will lead to death due to sleep apnea, no breathing during sleep, so he'll die. So this was Ondine's curse. There is a backstory in some mythology. This was interesting. So sleep apnea will occur. More importantly, Ondine's curse is known as central hypoventilation syndrome. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed and understood about the neural regulation of respiration. Thank you.